Transfusion, a study in the intersections of medical practice and the literary imagination in the 19th century in Britain, so in 19th century Britain. So getting that colon, I'm still not, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but transfusion is the crucial piece of that. And it's a medical, literary, and a cultural history of what I'm calling the first modern phase in the development of something that we now take for granted in medical practice, and that is blood transfusion. And by modern phase, I'm talking about everything pre-20th century. So I stopped this project in 1897. There's a lull in transfusion in the very later years of the 19th century. But I go from the late 17th century to the end of the 19th century, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So this project took me on a journey. It started in the final decades of the 17th century. Just for context, that's just after the restoration of the British monarchy in 1660, and about the same time that the English were renaming New Amsterdam, New York. So that's the beginning of this story. And it ended in 1897, as I say, and that, for context, is the year of the publication of Dracula, the first publication of Dracula. And because I have the great pleasure of addressing librarians, I want to pay special tribute to the various archives that I worked in for the years of this project. My main library was Harvard's Countway Medical Library. I spent many hours in the Countway, which I love. They have all their 19th century journals still in the stack, so you can go through and just look through. And that's where I learned how allergic I am to that dust that accumulates on 19th century paper. So I'd always leave with great hives, but with a lot of notes. So it was wonderful. I also did a lot of work in the British Library and the Library of the Wellcome Institute in London, which has it's focused on medicine and science. And then I made more disembodied journeys into various electronic databases. And so I do want to mention how transformative those have been for my work and the kind of research I do. So British periodicals online was really crucial for me. 19th century British newspapers was very important. And the flawed, but sometimes miraculous service known as Google Books that I did. I was able to find some crucial things on Google Books, which spared me trips across the sea. So my transfusion project follows two main currents, and one is the dramatic story of the development of the surgical operation of blood transfusion as a viable medical treatment. So just the medical content itself. The other current is the emergence of the idea of transfusion as a metaphor, an image, or a plot device in a wide range of literary genres in the 19th century. So satirical, sentimental, sensational, and Gothic literary texts. People working in all of these modes would exploit blood transfusion for their own purposes. But to speak as I do of the medical and the literary aspects of transfusion as two currents, rather than as two threads or two roads, for example, is to emphasize the fluidity of the boundaries between them, between the medical and the literary. And in this talk, I hope that fluidity will emerge powerfully, the way that these things are talking to each other and informing each other. So this project started for me with just simple curiosity. I was preparing to teach Bram Stoker's Dracula for maybe the fourth time. I'm rereading it, and this time around, I'd always been really riveted by the supernatural and the Gothic content, and every time I read it, I still get a little chill when Dracula climbs down the walls of his castle, or when he transports his coffins of earth to England so that he can prey on his unsuspecting neighbors. So I always enjoy that, but this time around, I found myself more interested in the medical content rather than the supernatural or the Gothic content. So what medical content? Well, as Count Dracula's lovely victim Lucy Westenra is wasting away, her rejected suitor, Dr. John Seward, so we have this physician enter into the scene, he summons his brilliant teacher, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, to help him on her baffling case. And it's worth noting that this part of Dracula is a sustained case history of a puzzling medical condition. So on Van Helsing's first visit to his new patient, he and Seward enter Lucy's bedchamber to find her, in Seward's words, ghastly, chalkily pale. The red seemed to have gone even from her lips and gums, and the bones of her face stood out prominently. Her breathing was painful to see or hear. And you'll recognize, these are all very acute descriptions of the symptoms of blood loss. And then Van Helsing looks at her and says, "There's no time to be lost. There must be a transfusion of blood at once." And this time around, this first one, using Lucy's fiancé as the blood donor, Van Helsing quickly performs a transfusion, and Seward describes the results on Lucy. As the transfusion went on, something like life seemed to come back to Lucy's cheeks. And on the following day, when the physicians visit her again, they're relieved to find her looking a different being from what she had been before the operation, full of a happy vivacity. This cure is short-lived, however, as Dracula continues to subvert attempts to protect Lucy from his nocturnal visits, and Van Helsing will perform 3 more emergency transfusions on Lucy, using a different blood donor each time. And eventually, medical intervention proves to be no match for the Count's supernatural power, and Lucy joins the ranks of the undead, and until she's staked, as you may know if you've read Dracula or seen Dracula. So, I found myself wondering whether Bram Stoker's fictional scenes of transfusion had any foundation in 19th century medical practice. Did 19th century physicians and surgeons actually perform such operations? And the short answer to that question turned out to be yes. But that answer was for me only the beginning. The milestones in the medical history of transfusion are clear, and I'll be going over them, some of the major ones in my talk. But as a person who spends her life reading literary texts, I became absorbed in something else as well. I became fascinated by the overall 19th century discourse of transfusion. So over the course of the 19th century, medical journals published dozens of first-hand accounts of transfusion experiments and detailed case histories, reported on live demonstrations of the operation, which were staged for medical practitioners and students, reprinted lectures delivered on the topic in London's famous teaching hospitals, summarized the debates about the operation's efficacy that were being held at meetings of various medical societies, and expressed their own editorial opinions regarding transfusion's usefulness and safety. And newspapers and periodicals for general readership reprinted or summarized some of these original materials, including private case histories, in columns with titles meant to catch the eye of the general reader, such as Science Gossip and Things Talked of in London. So you might turn to the column Science Gossip and read an actual case history of transfusion. In addition, all of the important 19th century medical encyclopedias and all of the major textbooks on the practice of midwifery or obstetric medicine included substantial discussions of the operation. And finally, just accumulating this massive material, 3 monographs written by medical professionals on the medical practice of transfusion appeared between 1875 and 1883. So this wealth of primary materials allows us a rare insight into a particular moment in medical history. It allows us to witness the impact of the introduction of a revolutionary and controversial surgical technique on the medical community and on its patients. So we get to see the medical community kind of justifying this new practice. So first, let me give you a quick overview of the history of what I'm calling the first modern phase in the medical practice of transfusion. The development of this practice in the Western world begins during what's called the scientific revolution of the late 17th century. Experiments in England and continental Europe, inspired by William Harvey's publications concerning the circulation of the blood, progressed rapidly from transfusions of blood between animals of the same species to transfusions between animals of different species, to transfusions of blood from animals most commonly, despite the illustration here, most commonly calves and lambs, to human beings, to men. So the early transfusionists were not primarily interested in the operation as a remedy for loss of blood. Rather, they saw it as a promising treatment for chronic or acute mental and physical diseases that they believed originated in the blood itself. And perhaps some experimenters even speculated transfusion would provide the key to rejuvenation or even to immortality. So there are these hopes that transfusion is going to be the answer to human mortality. Now, the first transfusion of blood into a human recipient was performed by the French physician Jean-Baptiste Denis in 1667. The patient was a boy of 15 or 16 years old who, after suffering a high fever, had become prey to a state of dullness and torpor. The assisting surgeon first bled the patient to remove blood to make room for new blood. Then Denis transfused into the boy's vein blood that he removed from the carotid artery of a lamb. And despite a temporary sensation of heat in his arm, the boy made a full recovery. The use of animal blood seems shocking, to say the least, to all of us, and especially at a time when we might assume that people would be even more squeamish than we are about maintaining the boundaries between the animal and the human. But the early transfusionists had two theoretical justifications for the use of animal blood. First, they viewed blood as the quintessence of the food that we eat, and therefore they saw transfusion merely as a form of intravenous feeding, so just another form of nutriment. And second, they viewed animal blood as inherently healthier than human blood because it was free of the corruption, of the sins and vices that could be said to define what it means to be human, so it's better than human blood even. Now, this first stage in transfusion's history came to an end in 1670, when the widely publicized death of another Frenchman after a series of transfusions of calf's blood led the French government to ban all such experiments. And other countries, the other countries who'd been kind of thinking about experimenting or experimenting themselves, followed suit with bans, either official or unofficial, shortly thereafter. Now, it's important to note, I've just said that this man died after a series of transfusions of calf's blood. I don't want transfusion to take the rap for that. I mean, it was not a safe practice, but that wasn't what killed him. His wife had poisoned him with arsenic, and that was, that was proven in court. But nevertheless, the whole scandal helped to galvanize opposition to the operation of transfusion itself. England's own unofficial moratorium on blood transfusion would last almost 150 years. The interest in transfusion, of course, didn't disappear during this hiatus, and throughout the 18th century, which is my period of specialization, but I have to sort of skip over it for transfusion. But throughout the 18th century, surgical treatises written for a medical or scientific audience included detailed instructions for performing the operation, even as they warned their readers against it. So as just one example of this, in his General System of Surgery, which was printed in Great Britain at least 9 times from 1743 to 1768, the famous German surgeon Lawrence Heister cautions that almost all the patients who have been this way treated by transfusion have degenerated into a stupidity, a foolishness, or a raving or melancholy madness, or else have been taken off with a sudden death, either in or not long after the operations. Now, none of that is true. The transfusion didn't, in fact, cause madness or kill anyone during its brief period of experimentation. Okay, but despite this hyperbolic and wildly inaccurate warning, Heister provides a technically complete description of the operation for his reader, accompanied by detailed illustrations. And so that's the illustration that we see here is the illustration of how to go ahead and perform a transfusion. And again, note he is using animal blood as the donated blood. But this is not a calf or a lamb. It seems to be some kind of deer. So references to blood transfusion are not limited to these works like Heister's that were aimed at what we now call a professional readership. They appear in a wide range of texts throughout the 18th century, books of medical advice for the layperson, biographies of the members of the Royal Society, and in the newly founded Encyclopedia Britannica. So people would definitely just have access to the whole concept of transfusion in a more general way. But we have it, there is this hiatus because we have this unofficial ban on experimentation. The actual practice of transfusion in Great Britain did not resume until 1818, when James Blundell, who was a lecturer on physiology and midwifery at Guy's Hospital in London, read a report before the Medico-Chirurgical Society describing a series of blood transfusions that he had conducted on dogs and urging that this useful surgery be developed so that it could be made available to humans. Now, Blundell's work departed from the 17th century model in some very crucial ways. First, you'll be happy to know he rejected interspecies transfusion. Blundell was convinced that only blood from human beings should go into human beings. Not all of the 19th century transfusionists who followed Blundell would agree with this rejection, and a number of 19th century fictions will exploit the idea of xenotransfusion, the use of animal blood, for their own sensational or horrific purposes, and I'd be happy to talk about the continuing legacy of xenotransfusion and the idea of that in the 19th century. But from Blundell on, the 19th century transfusionists were also careful to distance themselves from the wild hopes that the early modern experimenters had entertained. So no more talk about immortality or kind of wholesale curing of all kinds of illnesses. And at times, these 19th century practitioners express what seems a simply mechanical or hydraulic theory of the function of the blood itself. So Blundell points out that it's not necessary to replace the same amount of blood that the patient has lost to save the patient. Instead, one need only transfuse enough to, as he says, enable the heart and arteries to act, and to support the patient long enough to allow the vessels to accommodate themselves to the diminished volume of the blood. There's a sense that you just need a certain volume. Sir James Paget, the highly respected and influential surgeon who counted among his patients Queen Victoria, makes the analogy to a machine even more explicit. He writes, "The heart, just as is the case with a pump, requires the liquid to attain a certain height in order that it may act." But even these 19th century transfusionists' more modern or even mechanistic view of the blood's role in the body will not entirely displace a kind of rhetoric of vitalism or even a kind of magical rhetoric that verging on the mystical or the supernatural. So the same Paget, Sir James Paget, highly respected physician, he writes, "It would seem that health itself can be transfused with the blood of a healthy man." And another 19th century physician refers to the wonder and surprise excited by the almost miraculous resuscitations that transfusion has accomplished. And for its proponents, transfusion would seem to literalize the biblical phrase, "For the blood is the life." And this particular text, it's Deuteronomy 12:23, actually appears in the medical writings on transfusion. Surgeons and physicians are drawn to this biblical text as a way of highlighting the great potential of transfusion. Now, unlike the 17th century experimenters who had seen in the operation a potential cure for a multitude of mental and physical illnesses, Blundell focused on transfusion as the treatment for one specific medical crisis, one with which, as an obstetrician, he was all too familiar, and that is life-threatening hemorrhage. I see people nodding. They've already seen that coming, that's going to be this crucial moment for galvanizing interest in transfusion. In a series of lectures to his medical students, Blundell described how the experience of watching helplessly as his patients bled to death motivated his groundbreaking work. I'm going to be reading some quotations from Blundell, kind of liberal quotations from Blundell, because I want you to hear his voice. He has a very distinctive kind of writerly voice. "I've seen a woman dying for 2 or 3 hours together, convinced in my own mind that no known remedy could save her. The sight of these moving cases first led me to transfusion." Over and over again, Blundell invokes the spectacle of the female patient helplessly gripped in death's clutches. And here is Blundell again. "She's pale and ghastly, cold and gasping. Her heart flutters. There is little or no pulse in the wrist. She lives still, but the grave yawns under her, eager for its prey. Over the victim, death shakes his dart. And to you," to the physician or surgeon, "she stretches out her helpless hands for that assistance which you cannot give unless by transfusion." And in another dramatic passage, he describes the tragic end in store for this pathetic victim if transfusion is unavailable. "She sinks to rise and sink again, like the flashes of the half-extinguished taper. while, with a reluctance which avails her nothing, she is gradually subsiding lower, 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 till at length she suddenly drops into that grave from which, under the use of received remedies, no human art can save her. So Blundell's eloquence was renowned in his own day, and his rhetoric here belongs in the category of what literary critics would call the sentimental. That is, Blundell confronts his listeners or his readers with the pathetic, almost unbearable spectacle of a helpless victim, and that this victim is female is a fact that in and of itself heightens the sentimental scene. And he uses both a detailed description of intense bodily torment and a highly theatrical, or we might even say melodramatic language, in order to evoke his listeners' sympathy for this suffering subject. So paradoxically, it's this very sentimentalization of the patient that justifies her transformation into the subject of what is, after all, experimental surgery. So this woman is the material on which the experimental scientist is conducting his own experiments. Transfusion has a role to play in the great debate over vivisection in the later 19th century, and I'd be happy to talk about that more later as well. The advocates of transfusion acknowledge that the operation is a controversial one, and to counter resistance, they place a special stress on the pathos of obstetric trauma and on the painful burden that such a potential domestic tragedy places on the practitioner himself. As Robert Barnes, Dean of St. Thomas's Medical School, remarks in an essay on transfusion published in 1874, there is nothing more sad than to see a woman in labor or childbed bleed to death. The transfusionists refer to their obstetric patients as the most interesting part of the creation, and they remind their readers that each of these patients represents some life of more than ordinary moment. That is a special significance. And in the new life-saving role that transfusion offers the practitioner, doubt is its own punishment. As one proponent of the operation writes in 1826, "If there lives a skeptic to the powers of transfusion, he cannot receive a more just reward than in being ever shut out by his prejudices from the enjoyment of that satisfaction which results from so closely contributing to restoring a wife to her husband and a mother to her children." Now, the reintroduction of blood transfusion into actual medical practice is therefore inseparable from the increasing emphasis in the 19th century on the woman as a medical subject. And in some respects, it conforms to the gendered scene of Victorian medicine that's been the subject of much feminist scholarship over the past several decades. And so emphasizing, say, the development of the use of chloroform for treating women in childbirth, on this kind of discourse about the woman as the subject of Victorian medicine. And in this now standard reading of the enactment of medical authority and power, the masculine figure of scientific or medical expertise exerts his sometimes violent authority over the body of the woman, a body that through disease or trauma, or simply through the inevitable pathology that femininity itself represents in the Victorian world, has been identified as in need of his professional intervention. However, this is too simple an account to do justice to the complex innovation that transfusion represents, because transfusion brings into being an entirely new actor in the medical scene. It's not the doctor, it's not the patient, an actor who significantly transforms the medical drama by triangulating the relationship between doctor and patient, and one who introduces entirely new anxieties about the place of the non-professional in the medical scene. This is the figure of the live human donor. For the first time in medical history, a healthy human being will undergo a surgical intervention that is not entirely without risk or inconvenience, the opening of a vein, in order to aid in another person's medical treatment. So the 19th century practice of transfusion thus creates the first fully fledged example of what Catherine Waldby and Robert Mitchell, in their discussion of organ donation, will call a tissue economy. That is, in their words, a model of the body and of relationships between bodies in which one can share its vitality with another through the redistribution of tissues from donor to recipient through biotechnical intervention. So transfusion is the first such biotechnical intervention. And such an economy necessitates and itself accomplishes a crucial act of revaluation of a substance that has hitherto existed outside of the realm of exchange. So for Walby and Mitchell, one of their examples is umbilical cord blood, which until recently was considered valueless, and a tissue economy creates value out of this seemingly valueless substance. Well, transfusion itself converted what had been nothing but a worthless byproduct of surgery, blood that was in earlier operations simply medical waste, what we would call medical waste, converts it into a valuable substance for another's use. Or we might say, to use a word that invokes more explicitly the idea of exchange and also the specter of vampirism, converts it into a valuable substance for another's consumption. Transfusion allows us to witness a bodily product in that very process of migrating from the category of pure waste into the category of a substance whose reuse creates an almost incalculable value, life itself. Now let me back up just a bit. I've said that before the operation of transfusion, the blood that medical practitioners removed from bodies was simply treated as medical waste. I'd like to say a bit more about this earlier phase of medical history by turning to a brief discussion of the surgical intervention that had, until well into the 19th century, been considered an indispensable, if not the primary tool of the physician's art: bloodletting, also known as venesection or phlebotomy. Over the course of the 19th century, both medical and popular texts will describe a paradigmatic shift in medical theory and practice as the medical community abandoned its belief in and dependence on this earlier form of what was called heroic medicine. We still talk about heroic medicine. I always say, if you hear the term heroic medicine, run. That is a very, very frightening term. But the fate of the venerable operation of bloodletting, which so rapidly became the symbol of medical science's past ignorance, becomes intertwined with transfusion's own developing story because, of course, you have to be letting blood in order to transfuse blood. So the later operation depends on the earlier operation. Now, in January of 1865, the London Review of Politics, Society, Literature, Art, and Science published an article with the intriguingly Gothic title "Vampires," and oh, we think, here we go. You know, here's a proto-Dracula. But the vampires we meet in this article, they're not the undead rising from their graves to suck the blood of the living. Instead, they're medical practitioners. The writer begins by alluding to a day, the time of our great-great-grandmothers, when a man could scarcely set about any transaction in life without being, as a preliminary measure, bled. And this is the article. He would be let blood before he went on a journey, and he would be let blood when he came back. Bloodletting was the grand specific for all diseases. If a man broke his leg, you bled him. If he fainted, you had the bandage around his arm in a trice. The writer contrasts this past mania, that's the word in the article, for bleeding and for being bled, with the present day in which phlebotomy seems to have gone all but entirely out of fashion. That abominable little lancet with the tortoiseshell handle, the writer notes, and the lancet, as you may know, is the tool for bloodletting. The blade is on a kind of spring, and they're often very beautiful. Actually, if you get to see exhibits of them anywhere, they're often made of precious materials. This abominable little lancet is very rarely brought into requisition. The light tone should not obscure the essential truth of this writer's observations regarding bloodletting's former pervasiveness and its surprising decline. If the author exaggerates anything here, it's the length of time that bloodletting has been abandoned. What the editorial represents as a practice buried in the distant past, the time of his and his readers' great-great-grandmothers, was in fact at its height a mere 30 years before the article was written. In an essay titled "On the History of Bleeding and Its Disuse in Modern Practice," published in the British Medical Journal in 1875, W. Mitchell Clark, who was a consulting surgeon to the Bristol General Hospital, addresses with similar astonishment this abandonment of the old heroic plans. "We are not likely," he says, "to see so great a transformation again." And that Clark attributes this backlash against bloodletting to the excesses of past doctors. And a glance at a work devoted to the subject at the height of its popularity earlier in the century provides chilling evidence of such excess. Marshall Hall, who's an important experimental scientist as well as a renowned physician, devotes the first half of his 1830 monograph, Researches Relative to the Morbid and Curative Effects of Loss of Blood, to detailing what he calls the morbid effects of blood loss induced by excessive phlebotomy or bloodletting. And these are the symptoms that he details: syncope, fainting, convulsion, delirium, coma, and sudden death. Hall's examples are drawn from his own experience as a physician and from cases published in medical journals such as The Lancet, or cases that were communicated to him privately by his colleagues. I'll allow one case to represent all of those that Hall has assembled, and he's assembled dozens and dozens and dozens. The patient, a woman suffering from headache after labor, dreaded the idea of being bled and said it would certainly kill her. This is in the case history. She is bled nonetheless and appears to recover. It was thought proper, however, to abstract more blood, the case history goes on. 4 teacupfuls were taken. And that teacup, that's a unit of measurement that you hear a lot, both in transfusion and in bloodletting accounts, because all these operations are tending to happen at home. And so you have these kind of domestic details. So 4 teacupfuls were taken. The most dreadful fainting followed, with gasping, open mouth, a convulsive action of the diaphragm, and in an hour or 2, death closed the scene. So despite the tragedies that Hall's work catalogs, it was not his intention, nor was it the immediate effect of his treatise, to put an end to bloodletting. In fact, he himself remained convinced of the efficacy of the practice. So Hall's treatise is fascinating, not just for the insight it provides into 19th century medical practice, but for its own enactment of the conflict between a venerable medical tradition and modern science. And you see these two things colliding in Hall. He's gathering all the data, he's going over all of the evidence, he understands what he's seeing, and yet he can't abandon his own sense of commitment to this venerable tradition. So Hall himself remarks, "It sometimes requires no little boldness, sorry. There's some Freudian slip going on there. It sometimes requires no little boldness to abstain from the use of the lancet. And indeed, it would be impossible to overstate the identification of the physician himself with this instrument of his profession." And just think of the title, The Lancet, for one of the most important and historically important medical journals. If bloodletting had been the medical practitioner's most useful mode of treatment, the lancet had become the most common symbol of the physician's power. And even as he chronicles the obsolescence of bloodletting, another physician suspects that his colleagues, like retired gunslingers, are wistfully eyeing the weapons of their glory days, retaining a nostalgic attachment to the tools they have abandoned. And so here's another physician writing about the demise or the decline of bloodletting. "We are most decidedly living in one of the periods when the lancet is carried idly in its silver case. No one bleeds. And yet, from the way in which I find that my friends retain their lancets and keep them from rusting, I cannot help thinking that they look forward to a time when they will employ them again." And again, the surgeon's tool here is a kind of a fetish object. I mean, it has all of this interest and power. So I'm going to turn to a work of fiction now, and there are many stories that employ the device of blood transfusion in the 19th century. So here's one that's published the year before Dracula by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who's a friend of Stoker's, and she actually writes him a congratulatory note on the publication of Dracula, saying that he outdid her own humdrum little story of transfusion, that her humdrum little story of transfusion is Good Lady Duquesne. And Braddon exploits the sensational potential of the alliance between the exploded heroic treatment of bloodletting and the newfangled, that's her term, operation of transfusion. And together, these interventions create what I would call a surgical vampire. When we first meet the heroine of Braddon's tale, Bella Rolleston, she's fresh, blooming, a living image of youth and hope. But after some months in the service of the grotesquely superannuated Lady Duquesne, Bella begins to fade. Her decline coincides with the appearance of puzzling, angry marks on her round white arms, wounds which Lady Duquesne's personal physician, the sinister Dr. Paravicini, assures Bella are only the bites of Italian mosquitoes. And he says, "The pest has caught you on the top of a vein. What a vampire," he says to her about her latest injury. In fact, Dr. Paravicini has been chloroforming Bella, bleeding her, and injecting her young blood into the veins of her employer. And a number of ladies' companions have already died in Lady Duquesne's service because of this. Fortunately, Bella has attracted the professional and romantic interest of Herbert Stafford, a young man who has received the most up-to-date medical education in Edinburgh and Paris and has just finished a 2-year hospital residency. While for the reader, Bella's symptoms and her employer's extraordinary longevity all point too obviously to the conventions of a Gothic tale of vampirism, Stafford interprets Bella's case differently. In the one genuinely chilling moment of the story, examining her arms in the broad sunlight, Stafford finds them covered with scars, new and old. These he immediately recognizes as the marks of a lancet. "This is no mosquito bite," he exclaims. "It is not a bite at all. You are trifling with me. Miss Rolleston, you have allowed that wretched Italian quack to bleed you." As Stafford's aggrieved tone indicates, there's more at stake in this scene than diagnosis. Discredited, detached from any legitimate medical context, the scene of bloodletting that he imagines here can only be a private, illicit, and perhaps even erotic transaction. She's been letting Dr. Paravicini play doctor with her, is what he's saying to this quack. In this story of transfusion, Bella's blood is being stolen from her. But I'd like to consider in more detail another of transfusion's most important roles in the history of medical science. Its creation of the idea of the donation of one's own bodily resources. So we're to that creation of an entirely new participant in the surgical scene, that live human donor. And the 19th century scene of transfusion is much more dramatic than the blood donation we're used to today, because the early transfusionists were unable to store blood. In the midst of life-threatening medical emergencies, they were forced to recruit donors from those nearby and had to bring them to the bedside or very close to the bedside of the patient. Sometimes the case histories are vague about the donors, referring merely, for example, to some gentleman present who undertook to supply a few ounces of blood, but more frequently we get more detail about the donors. One large donor pool consists of the patient's close relatives. And the case histories refer to fathers, sisters, and even sons giving blood to dying patients. It's also not uncommon for the attending physicians or medical students to supply blood. One proud physician recounts, "No sooner was the necessity of transfusion known to the pupils present than several of them volunteered the one thing required, the blood." Another physician recalls witnessing a transfusion at St. Thomas's Hospital in which blood was freely given by a number of dressers, those hospital workers whose job it was to dress wounds, one or two of whom fainted in consequence of their generous gift and the heat of the small ward crowded with students. On one occasion, after a first donor is exhausted, the surgeon takes blood from his nephew, and this is from the case history, a healthy youth about 14 years of age whom I had taken with me for the purpose. So it's kind of ambulatory adolescent blood bank. Many 19th century transfusions were performed in the patient's homes, as I mentioned, and servants, including cooks, butlers, and gardeners, also appear in the case histories as donors. One physician, after referring gratefully to the assistance rendered him by two fellow medical professionals who were in attendance, adds, "It would be ungrateful not to admit that a large part of the success of the operation is due to the coachman who acted as blood donor, and who was not only collected and cheerful, but able to make several useful suggestions during the process of transfusion." And so there are two things I want to point out about that particular thing. There's absolutely no anxiety about mingling class blood here. And also that it highlights again the way that transfusion doesn't correspond completely to the idea of medical authority that excludes the layperson, that it creates a kind of a more free-floating sense of the medical scene. And so and also just as an aside, about the lack of anxiety about mingling the blood of men and women or mingling the blood of people from different classes, the medical discourse itself registers none of that. The fictions really enjoy exploiting those kinds of anxieties to a certain extent, and I'd be happy to talk more about those alternative fictions later. I'd like to place the new figure of the donor in the context of the surgery itself as it was practiced in the 19th century. The method of transfusion that Blundell introduced and that his followers practiced would become known as immediate transfusion, in which the donor's blood was collected in a vessel and then injected into the recipient's vein. And the equipment for immediate transfusion could be quite minimal, some kind of receptacle and a syringe. And so this is an illustration of a funnel and syringe designed for use in immediate transfusion. Over the years, however, practitioners exercised no little ingenuity in developing various devices designed to facilitate the operation. Blundell himself was an enthusiastic inventor of such medical machinery, and he introduced a number of instruments. One he called the impeller, and a bit later another called the gravitator. And so I want to show you what those kinds of things look like. So here is Blundell's impeller, and it was meant to be mounted, as you see here, on the back of a chair. And so that's the vessel for collecting the blood. And then just to give you a sense of how complex these machines were, this is a cross-section of his later development, the impeller, to show you just how elaborate a mechanism this was. And you're certainly not able, I'm sure, to read all of the description. I just wanted to give you a sense of how complex it would be. So frustrated with such complex and ingenious machinery, which was not surprisingly prone to malfunction, a number of transfusions championed an alternative technique. So these devices motivate another approach to transfusion, and this was known as immediate transfusion, in which the veins of the donor and recipient were connected by a much simplified apparatus, the blood flowing directly from one to the other, just with the minimal help of a kind of pumping device in the middle. The most prominent advocate for immediate transfusion was J.H. Aveling, the founder of the Sheffield Hospital for Women. Again, you're hearing all these obstetricians are playing a role here. The heart itself is, in Aveling's own words, the most perfect of all transfusion apparatuses. And in his transfusion mechanism, he attempted to replicate this perfect and perfectly simple apparatus. And so this was what he developed. So this is Aveling's method of immediate transfusion. In 1873, after having carried this apparatus about in his pocket for 8 years, Aveling was finally able to put his design to the test. Although only one of his first 2 cases ended in the patient's recovery, he said the mechanism itself performed satisfactorily. So it's one of those things, the operation was successful, but the patient died, and the mechanism is fine. It's just not really saving life. Aveling's energetic advocacy for his technique sparked a lively debate in the medical community, but this controversy is not simply a disagreement concerning the most effective medical technology. We can get a sense of what else is at stake in this debate by looking at 2 sketches published in medical journals of the techniques in use. Both represent what we might call the primal scene of 19th century transfusion, the injection of blood from a male donor into the veins of a female patient. In both, the operator is conspicuously absent. The only 2 people in these tableaus are the donor and the recipient. And again, I want to emphasize how the practice of transfusion complicates the traditional story of the consolidation and preservation of medical authority and power in the person of the physician. In these sketches, the physician is absent. In the first sketch, the donor stands, his right sleeve rolled up as if for manual labor. This is Blundell's gravitator in action. So you can see the chair there and the instrument mounted on it, and then you see the heroic donor. His arm with its prominent muscles is extended above the funnel of the transfusion apparatus in a gesture of physical strength and heroic self-sacrifice. He appears unaffected as his blood flows freely, even gracefully, into the machine. Now compare this to the second sketch. This is a sketch that J.H. Aveling made himself of his form of immediate transfusion. No longer standing heroically, the donor is sitting on the floor next to the bed, and the clumsy perspective even makes it look as if he's lower than the patient herself. Although he's clenching his fist, there's no articulation of the musculature in his arm. It's as smooth as the woman's. There's nothing that marks this male donor as active. On the contrary, we seem to witness the union of two passive bodies. Looking at these two sketches, we can see that what is most importantly mediated in immediate transfusion through those impellers or their gravitators is the relationship between donor and recipient. The machine interposes itself between the two parties, enabling the flow of blood from one to the other only by first channeling this vital fluid through its own mechanism. Aveling's minimal apparatus would seem instead to forge a union between the two bodies themselves. And this union is not a symbiotic one. As one half of this artificially created single organism benefits, the other loses. And blood donation is a zero-sum activity here. As Dr. Seward remarks in Dracula, after he himself has acted as a blood donor for his beloved Lucy, the draining away of one's blood, no matter how willingly it be given, is a terrible feeling. As practitioners debated the merits of immediate transfusion, they focused their attention on the effect of the scene of trauma on the donors. Remember, they have to come one of the things that immediate transfusion offers is the ability to separate people into different rooms, or at least different parts of rooms. Immediate transfusion, is even, you have to bring people right next to each other. But with either version, you still have to have people fairly close. It's not, you don't go donate blood somewhere and then that blood mysteriously ends up with the person who needs it. So they focused on the effect of the scene of trauma on the donors, especially the patient's loved ones. Increasingly, the opponents of immediate transfusion emphasize its impact on the husband donors in particular. One critic of Aveling's proposal declares, "The person about to part with the blood, and who is generally the husband or some near relative, should not be brought to the bedside of the patient, whose alarming appearance at such a moment would inevitably produce the deepest anguish and agitation." The obstetrician J. Braxton Hicks, that name may be familiar to you from, he gave the name to those false labor contractions. He writes in 1869, "Where the husband has to be brought into the room, the flow of blood is often very slow. For be one as careful as one can, the whole scene is appalling to a man never used to such a sight, and conscious that his wife is in extreme jeopardy." In one unforgettable case in which the patient dies, the reporting physician writes, "The only chance of saving her life would have been by transfusion. But where was the blood donor to be found in this case? The husband was wandering about the room in the greatest alarm, pale as ashes. No man could have got a drop of blood from him." I always get goosebumps reading that. That to me is just much more chilling than anything in Dracula, to imagine this poor man in this scene of trauma. Indeed, if James Blundell's Lancet lectures represent the idealized and sentimentalized narrative of transfusion, remember those images of fluttering hearts and tapers that I just read, the case histories provide something much more Gothic, the lurid spectacle of the drained and corpse-like body of the woman on the brink of the grave. Now I'm going to read from the case histories. I'm sorry this follows dinner. I don't think it's too, but it's painful. The case histories describe blood soaking through the bed upon the floor, patients found lying in a large pool of blood or found lying swamped in blood. The women who become the subjects of transfusion are, in the words of Charles Waller, who was a lecturer on midwifery at St. Thomas's Hospital, as near death as it is possible for anyone to be without being actually dead. And here are just a few of the physician's detailed descriptions of these patients. "When I entered the room, the patient was to all external appearance dead, lying on her back completely blanched, her face pale as the sheet that covered her." Another patient. "She was found with a most death-like expression of countenance. Her extremities were of a marble coldness." Another. "I found her lying in a large pool of blood. The skin and extremities had become cold, and the surface of the body as white as snow, eyes sunken and leaden." Another. "Her countenance was blanched and cadaverous. Every now and then a cessation of the pulse, a livid hue of the face, and motionless position of the body marked a temporary loss of consciousness, which I more than once mistook for death." So faced with these graphic descriptions, we'd say that transfusion does not so much prevent the deathbed scene as say that it first requires the performance of the deathbed scene in order to provide it with a sequel. Because of the controversial nature of the practice, physicians and surgeons waited until they believed their patients were beyond all other chance of recovery before having recourse to transfusion. Thus, these women seemed to be not so much healed as raised from the dead. In the words of one surgeon writing in 1857, the change was immediate. The color returned to her lips, the eyes became brilliant, the pulse distinct and firm, and she now looks, with the exception of her whitened skin, as well as I ever saw her. And another article describes the eerie moments when these dead awaken. Some have started up as from a long sleep, moved their limbs and asked for food. Others, even those who eventually recovered, have only slowly shown signs of returning life. And the more disquieting possibilities of resurrection are hinted at in the following report. The patient opened her eyes. The face reddened and the heart palpitated strongly. A frothy saliva issued from the mouth, and the respiration became deep and rapid. And this doctor leaves the room for a bit, and on returning, he finds the patient with her eyes wide open and an expression on her countenance as of one who had returned from the other world. On the 18th day, he reports, she was able to get up and forgot that she had been as one dead for upwards of a quarter of an hour. She is now the mother of a large family. The transition from the experience of death, the image of the woman with her eyes wide open with an expression as of one who had returned from the other world, the movement from that to the erasure of this experience, the insistence on her forgetfulness of it, is haunting in itself, as if Lazarus had no memory of having been in the tomb. The evocation of the sentimental here, the happy news that this woman is now the mother of a large family, seems partly to be an attempt to deny the Gothic possibilities of these scenes of near death and resurrection. In these case histories, there's a transformation from something strange and potentially horrifying, and that transformation can be undone by the woman's inscription into the role of the angel in the house, the domestic idol of Victorian culture. And I'd like to end by juxtaposing one of the 19th century case histories of transfusion with the literary text that initially inspired my interest in this subject, Dracula. So we're going to hear, we heard about the transfusions in Dracula earlier, and now I want you to hear the language from, this is an actual case history from 1870. The Dublin Quarterly Journal of Medical Science published this dramatic account by Thomas E. Beatty, MD, former president of the King and Queen's College of Physicians in Ireland. Called to the bedside of a woman who has given birth prematurely, Beatty finds the patient pale, pulseless, and cold as marble. Attempts to revive her with stimulants fail. She became insensible, the countenance became ghastly, and the jaw dropped. All trace of pulse had long vanished, and death seemed very near at hand. Under these desperate circumstances, Beatty determined not to let her die without making the only effort that in my mind could save her, and that is transfusion. Quickly, Beatty and a colleague set to work. The patient's extreme blood loss makes it difficult to find a vein. And here's how Beatty describes it. The patient was as a corpse, bloodless. There was no trace of a vein to be found. So the practitioner split open the skin of the woman's arm, quoting again, leaving a wide gaping wound which displayed the veins at the bottom, resembling small, flat, dead earthworms. Even it gets more and more. I mean, even the earthworms are dead in this. It's kind of in such an intense Gothic description. They are now, however, able to proceed with the transfusion using blood from the patient's husband, and Beatty reports the results. It was intensely interesting to watch the effect produced by the introduction of this vital fluid. The countenance became less ghastly, and imminent death seemed warded off when the last portion of blood had been injected. And indeed, this patient makes a full recovery. The practitioner called to the bedside of a woman close to death from the loss of blood, the insistence on the critical condition of the patient with a detailed description of the visible signs of impending death, the ad hoc recruitment of a blood donor, the hasty performance of the operation. All of these details are repeated over and over in the case histories that appeared in medical journals and medical monographs from the 1820s on, whether these cases end in the recovery or the death of the patient. And as we've already seen, this is also the narrative outline that Stoker follows in Dracula. In these case histories, however, I want to emphasize the female patient's transformation into something strange can be reversed by restoring her to her role as mother. Now, the patient I referred to above, remember, who lives to become the mother of a large family. But if the productive female body can rehabilitate or erase the Gothic possibilities it has given rise to, the non-productive female body cannot offer this redemption. Dracula's victim Lucy does not give birth, but in her repeated depletions and transfusions, she seems doomed to enact over and over the trauma of a near-fatal labor with, as the puzzled John Seward says, no sign to show for it. Thus, while Lucy Westenra does not give birth to a child, by paying attention to the ways in which her case and the treatment she receives so closely mirror the 19th century case histories, we can see the obstetric context of the operation is hidden within the fictional narrative from which it would seem at first to be absent. What is being born in these scenes in Dracula as the innocent victim drains her clueless donors, providing further meals for Dracula himself, what is being given birth to in these scenes is Lucy's own new identity as a vampire. Thank you.